Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Nicola Koper from the University of Manitoba will be speaking about the effects of oil development and anthropogenic noise on grassland songbirds in Canada. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation, either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. And we have a great lineup of speakers scheduled. We'll be hosting our next speaker series on December 1st. Rob Gardner will be discussing drought proofing. Join us on January 14th for a presentation by University of Regina Master's candidate Shana Hamilton on her research with Prussian carp. And you don't want to miss our February 10th webinar by Laurel Berkeley with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. She'll be speaking about greater sage grouse in Montana. You can register for these webinars through the PCAP website, and all past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be uploaded there in the near future as well. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our gold sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Pembina Pipelines, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our bronze sponsors are Camp Wolf Willow, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. And just a note to our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the chat section or the question section of the webinar dashboard. If you're on a cell phone, you can send your questions in by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Dr. Nicola Koper is a professor of conservation biology at the Natural Resources Institute of the University of Manitoba and focuses on avian conservation in Canada and the neotropics. She has studied impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns, energy development, agroecosystems, and habitat loss and fragmentation on birds. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Koper.
Let's see if this works. I don't see my screen.
Oh, we can see it here okay.
Oh, okay. So let me just minimize.
I think if you just, yeah, if you launch the PowerPoint, it should go perfect.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay, that's great. Sorry, everybody. Let me see if I can make that smaller as well. And now I cannot see my screen. Sorry, I'm sure this will sort itself out at some point.
Are you looking for the webinar screen or the PowerPoint?
I can't see my PowerPoint screen for some reason.
Okay, what if you minimize the webinar one?
Yeah, I'm trying to. It doesn't seem to give me a minimize option.
There's an orange arrow on the right of on the right hand side, and if you click that, that'll kind of push things out. I don't know if that opens it up for you.
Yeah, it made it worse. That was what my problem was. Okay, everything is fine now. I basically can see my screen. Okay, you guys can see my screen too?
Yes, and we can see you. It's perfect.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for your patience, and thanks for coming to this presentation about effective energy development and noise on grassland songbirds in Canada. And you can see from my author list here that the work I'm presenting here, a lot of the credit goes to my graduate student and postdoc fellows who've contributed a lot of the hard work behind the research I'm going to present today. And really, it was all a major team effort. So we have lots of species at risk in Canada that are birds from our grassland systems. And this shows many of our grassland birds found across from Alberta into Manitoba. Most of the ones shown here are species at risk, such as bobolinks, burrowing owls, Sprague's pipits, chestnut-collared longspurs. Western meadowlarks are not at risk, but are still declining, like many of our other grassland birds. Probably a lot of you have seen this graph before, but it's useful to use it to highlight the fact that grassland birds are declining more than birds from any other habitat type across all of Canada and North America. And as such, we need to put a lot of effort into conserving this species, this group of species. And I want to point out too that we see these declining patterns across not just a small number of species, but across more than half of our species of grassland birds are declining significantly across North America. So they're really a significant conservation problem at the moment. The reasons for these most of the time come down to habitat fragmentation and loss. Can you guys see my little cursor, my arrow?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. That's just useful for the rest of my presentation. Okay, so the bottom left image here illustrates habitat loss and fragmentation, which is really the leading cause for declines of grassland birds. And these are, let's say, exacerbated by invasion of non-native species into the grasslands that are there. Some varied changes in predator communities across these landscapes, and also impacts of industrial activity that impacts the grasslands that remain on these landscapes. So the oil and natural gas industry is really a tremendously large industry that we can expect to have on our landscapes for many years to come. Just to illustrate how significant the economic impacts are, we still produce about 100 million barrels of oil per day. The oil and natural gas industry represents about 2.5% of the global GDP, so it's tremendously important. It's also particularly important to North America, where we have 1.7 million active wells in the US and about 200,000 active wells in Canada. And prior to the pandemic, the Alberta government's revenue, about 11% of the Alberta government's revenue was from oil and gas payments, which of course also explains why they're in the current economic situation out there, because they're so tremendously dependent on this industry. So it's economically important and impacts a really large geographic extent. And as such, I think we can expect it to be around for a while. So I'm interested in what we can do to minimize and mitigate the environmental impacts that there might be of it without expecting it to go away completely in the short term. So oil wells have a number of different potential impacts on the landscape. So you can see from these little well pads here that there is some habitat loss when we put in a well pad, but it doesn't cover very much of the area. It covers about, in many systems, it's sort of in the 1 to 3% of the landscape is lost to the well pads. So it doesn't cause very much habitat loss. Of course, it is associated with some additional linear developments, like the introduction of roads, additional roads in addition to those that were there originally. But what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today is the potential acoustic footprint from the noise of this infrastructure. And one of the reasons I find the noise so interesting from a management perspective is, first of all, anthropogenic noise, so human caused noise, is of course widely spread across our landscapes. There are very few landscapes where there's no anthropogenic noise present at all. It really, especially across North America, we have tremendous areas impacted by human noise, from transportation industry as well as from extractive industries and all sorts of other industries. And you can see that the footprint from an acoustic perspective is really tremendously large. So this blue circle, for example, shows the area that in which a savanna sparrow would be able to hear the noise of a screw pump that happens to be powered with a generator. And the radius here is more than 1/2 kilometer. So clearly just one well on the landscape has a really large footprint. And when we add up all the other wells on the landscape, then the cumulative acoustic footprints of the oil industry could be, pretty substantial. However, from a management perspective, one of the nice things about noise is that we can actually do something about it. So there's a number of commercially available ways of minimizing noise from all sorts of industrial sources. So for example, if we take this screw pump and instead of powering it using a generator, which is really noisy, if we power it instead by hooking it up to the provincial power grid, then its footprint is much, much smaller. So this is as illustrated through our calculations with this little yellow circle here. So I think a lot of people are interested in noise because, for example, because there's a number of ecological reasons why we might expect noise to have impacts on birds, but also because there's something we can actually do about it without completely removing the industry from these landscapes. And so it seems like a manageable environmental problem. So there's a number of ecological reasons we might expect there to be effects of this acoustic noise footprint on the landscape. Particularly in the context of birds, where I've done most of my research, although this impacts many other species as well. So noise from wells can result in masking of signals or acoustic information so that signals can no longer be heard. Noise itself can be a distraction from other things that birds need to do, like feeding their young or looking after themselves, feeding themselves. The noise itself could be perceived as a threat. And because of all of these effects of wells, in the presence of noise, birds tend to show increased vigilance, which means basically that they spend more time listening and looking around to ensure that they're safe rather than doing things like feeding themselves. And this increased vigilance does result in decreased foraging rates. And of course, not surprisingly, noise may also decrease foraging success. So if you can't hear your prey or you can't hear it very well, then you might not be able to find your prey either. So there's lots of ecological reasons why noise might be important and have an impact on these landscapes. So this interest in the oil and gas industry has led to our research for the last 10 to 12 years, I guess, on effects on a wide variety of grassland songbirds. So these include savanna sparrows, Sprague's pipits, vesper sparrows, and chestnut-collared longspurs. Longspurs are federally threatened, and Sprague's pipits are federally threatened. These two sparrow species are not threatened, but they're still declining significantly, like the populations of most grassland birds. Our research is done in southern Alberta, in this area here, which has the highest density of oil and gas wells across all of Canada, which is why we work there. So what I'm going to do next is tell you about a couple of different studies that we've done in that part of Alberta, and I'll explain to you how we set up the studies and then what our results are. And then at the very end of the presentation, we'll talk a bit about how we can mitigate effects of the oil and gas industry. So one of the first things we wanted to do was compare effects of pump jacks and screw pumps. So these are two different types of wells. But as you can guess from my introduction, I'm also really interested in noise. So we compared pump jacks and screw pumps that were turned on with pump jacks and screw pumps that were turned off, so that we could see whether the infrastructure, when it had noise present, had a greater impact on birds than when the infrastructure was present, but there was no noise at all there. And of course, we compared these with control sites that had neither noise nor the infrastructure present. And we did this research across a wide range of different sites, including 37 quarter sections and covering about 4,000 hectares. So we used a range of different ways of collecting data on the birds that we studied. These included simply watching the birds and counting them. We found and monitored nests to see whether a nest that was started actually ended up producing young, and also how many young were produced per nest. So when I use the word nesting success later on, what that means is whether a nest where eggs were laid actually ended up producing at least one offspring. We also took the little nestlings that are in the nest, and when they were in the nest, we put these little backpack transmitters on them. And then when they left the nest and fledged, we were able to follow them around with telemetry equipment and assess every day whether they were actually alive. And so how long did they survive under when they were in the presence of infrastructure versus in control sites. We also used nest cameras to watch the behavior of birds when they were looking after their nests. And we captured adults, and we also took nestlings out of the nests, and we took blood samples as well as measurements, and this allowed us to assess how healthy they were and also what their blood hormone levels were, particularly in the context of stress hormones. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you about the results from this experiment I've just explained to you, where we were looking at real infrastructure that was turned off and comparing it with real infrastructure that was on and therefore noisy, and comparing it with real infrastructure that was turned off. So the first result I want to tell you about is that it was very clear that Baird sparrow abundances and Sprague's pipits abundances were significantly lower when they were in sites that had either pump jacks or screw pumps, although the effects of both pump jacks and screw pumps were generally fairly similar to one another. And we also compared whether wells that were powered by generators had the same kind of ecological impact as wells that were powered when they were connected to the provincial power grid. And we had predicted, based on our observation, that the pump jacks with generators were much louder than the pump jacks that were powered by the provincial power grid. So we'd predicted that they would be have much more of an impact if they were powered by generators. But surprisingly, that's actually not what we found. We found that if they were powered by the provincial power grid, those wells had a much greater impact on the species that avoided wells. And we really don't know for sure why this is. One possible explanation for it is that if it's connected to the provincial power grid, there is some additional external equipment and distribution lines associated with them in some cases, and that may attract predators. But I think what is really important here is that it's clearly not the case that the noisier well has a greater impact, suggesting that it's not the noise that explains why we see these negative impacts of real infrastructure. And in fact, we get the same conclusion when we looked at the infrastructure turned on versus infrastructure that was turned off. If we take these wells and we turn them off so that they're not making any noise at all, they continue to have exactly the same amount of ecological impact as if they were making noise in the first place. So again, this suggests that it's not the noise from the infrastructure that is explaining why wells have a negative impact on birds. It's the presence of the infrastructure itself. And we see exactly the same patterns when we looked at nesting success. So the ability to raise young in these areas. We have lower nesting success in the presence of wells. In this case, we had even lower nesting success in the presence of screw pumps than pump jacks. But there was no difference in the impact for the wells that were turned on versus the wells that turned off. So again, this suggests that it's the physical infrastructure present that is causing these negative impacts on nesting success. It's not the noise from the wells that's causing those impacts. So when we look at this study where we had real infrastructure, the take-home messages are that clearly oil wells do have some negative impacts on birds. The impacts of the real infrastructure are primarily caused by the presence of the wells and any kind of associated linear developments like roads. And there's little evidence that there are impacts of the noise per se. But we still wanted to understand the effects of noise on these species when we removed the impact of the real infrastructure. So we did a second experiment where we took recordings of pump jacks and screw pumps, and we also took recordings of the well drilling noise itself. So when wells are drilled, they're noisy, they make different kinds of noises over the course of the drilling process, and they're only there for a short time. So in general, that makes the drilling noise itself very unpredictable, whereas in contrast, the operating noise of these wells are predictable and cyclic. And so we wanted to understand what are the differences between predictable operating noise from wells and unpredictable drilling noise that was just there temporarily on the landscape. So we took recordings from these different types of energy infrastructure and played them back in sites that were control sites and had no oil well presence. So we designed and built a way for us to do this at a very high fidelity. And we spent a lot of time making sure we could really accurately reproduce the soundscape that had been produced by the pump jacks and screw pumps and the drilling wells under real world circumstances. So after a while, we were able to reproduce the noise really accurately. And so for this next part of the presentation, I'm going to tell you the results from some of our treatments, which include pump jacks that were powered by the provincial power grid, pump jacks powered by the generators, and recordings of well drilling noise. So in order to make this sound reproduction as accurate as possible, when we looked at the pump jack well operating noise, we played it for 24 hours a day for 90 days per year. So basically during the entire breeding season for the birds that we were studying. On the other hand, in this system, it takes about 10 days to drill a well. And therefore, for this treatment, we took well drilling noise and we played it 24 hours a day for 10 days. And then we took a break in that treatment for 10 to 15 days where there was no well drilling noise. And then we went back and played it again in order to increase our sample sizes. So the take-home message here is that the pump jacks are on for a short period of, for 100% of the time during the breeding season. The well drilling noise was on for about 22% of the time for each breeding season. And of course, we compared these with two different types of controls. And this experiment took place across about 29 quarter sections, covering about 2,000 hectares altogether. So now I'm going to move on to talking to you about some of our results. And I want to remind you that the effects I'm going to talk about are not the effects of the real wells. They're effects just of the noise from the wells, which are played in sites that have no oil infrastructure present at all. So first, we looked at abundance of four-focal species, including chestnut-collared longspurs, savanna sparrows, Sprague's pipits, and vesper sparrows. So when we played the recordings of the pump jack noise, most of the species did not respond to that noise at all. Chestnut-collared longspur abundances did decline in areas where there was pump jack noise being played, but we also found no effect of the pump jack noise on the nesting success of any of the species that we looked at. So the result we see here is pretty similar to what we found when we looked at the real infrastructure, where we took the noise and where we took the infrastructure and turned it off. In both of those studies, we conclude that there's really relatively little impact of operating noise from wells on the birds that we studied. Although before I move on, I want to just point out that the one exception to that is that chestnut-collared longspurs did avoid the pump jack operating noise. And as such, because it's a species at risk, we might need to take that into consideration from a management perspective. But in general, across the whole grassland bird community, there really isn't much of an effect of oil well operating noise. But we see a different impact when we look at the drilling noise. So in sites that had drilling noise, we see declines in 2 out of our 4 focal species. So chestnut-collared longspurs and savanna sparrows both avoided sites where we were playing the drilling noise, and we get very substantial effects of drilling noise on nesting success as well. So for savanna sparrows, if they started a nest, so if they made their nest and they laid eggs in it, only we get a substantial decline in the probability that those nests will produce young. So we get a 35% decline in nesting success of savanna sparrows if they're in sites where the drilling noise was present. And we get a whopping 85% decline in nesting success for Sprague's pipits, which is one of our threatened species, in sites where there was drilling noise. So taken together, 3 out of our 4 focal species that we could study here responded negatively to the drilling noise. And one of the things I want to remind you about is that the drilling noise was only on for 22% of each of the breeding seasons, while in contrast, the well operating noise was on for 100% of the time. And so this drilling noise, even though it's there for a very short period of time, it has this really tremendous ecological impact, which I suspect is because it's unpredictable and so it's hard to adapt to. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. So in terms of the take-home messages from our noise playback experiment, drilling noise has very large negative impacts on grassland birds. Operating noise does have some impacts, but these are clearly much less than the effects of the drilling noise. And I also want to point out that noise that's on for longer is not necessarily ecologically worse. And this is important because some of the noise legislation that's been discussed recently in Canada considers noise that has a longer duration to be more impactful, whereas our study actually showed the opposite. Probably because of the element of predictability. But that does suggest to me that we need to think about and regulate noise in a different way than we have so far. So now you've got the basic patterns we've talked about so far. I think the next question is, why do we see those patterns? So why are birds less successful at raising young, first of all, near real wells, and second of all, in sites that have drilling noise? So I'm going to tell you about 2 hypotheses we've looked at so far. And the first one is whether wells or noise change the predator community. And it's this change in the predator community that results in decreased productivity in sites where there are wells or drilling noise. So I'm going to show you some preliminary results here from 2019. And of course, we had hoped to have more data by now, but we don't have more data because 2020, we weren't able to go out and have our field season. So these are based on sample sizes that are really lower than I'd like to have, and we're certainly going out next year to collect more data and to be more confident in the results. So just consider these preliminary. But so far, I would point out first that mice and voles, which are important nest predators in the system, there seemed to be no effect either of the presence of wells or noise on mice and voles. There's also no effect of wells or noise on abundance of the raptors overall. In the case of ground squirrels, which are another nest predator, we do have some evidence that perhaps there's higher abundances of ground squirrels in sites that have wells present. And so that might have something to do with why we also have lower nesting success in sites with wells being present, where the wells are present. But overall, there's really no smoking gun here, I would say. So there isn't strong evidence that the effects that we see of wells and noise on nesting success are caused by the predator community. So if the predator community doesn't explain these patterns, then what else might it be that could explain why they can't raise their young very successfully in these environments? So next we looked at whether wells or noise change how well parents can look after their offspring. So what we did in this case is we took cameras that were cleverly camouflaged, as you can see from this image. Actually, most of them had like more sage on them and stuff like that. We then put them close to and facing nests of chestnut-collared longspurs, and we used this to evaluate whether the behavior of birds was similar, that how well they looked after their nest was similar in these different treatments. So we found that if nests are close to wells, then females spent less time incubating the eggs. Males spent less time feeding his mate while she was incubating. And once the eggs had hatched, both parents spent less time feeding and caring for their nestlings. In contrast, if nests were far from wells, then females spent more time incubating their eggs. Males spent more time feeding their mates while they were incubating, and both parents spent more time feeding and caring for their nestlings. We did find that these effects are a little bit stronger when the infrastructure was turned on, i.e. noisy, but even wells that were turned off have these effects. So the bulk of the problem is probably caused by the infrastructure, not its noise, although the noise in this case has some additive effects. In general, though, it's clear that there is much better care of offspring far from wells than close to wells. And this may explain why the nests that are far from the wells were more likely to produce young and produced more young than if they were close to wells or close to roads. So I think that does help to answer some of the questions we posed earlier about why we observed low nesting success in the presence of infrastructure. But there's an interesting little twist to the story that I want to tell you about before we move on towards the end of the presentation. So there's a surprising pattern such that when we took blood samples from the nestlings, these blood samples show that nestlings that are near wells are actually less stressed, and they're also in better body condition, so they're heavier than nestlings that were far from wells. So this seems particularly surprising given that we actually know from our previous research that they're also more at risk of being eaten if they are close to the wells. So why would they be less stressed if that was the case? So I'm going to propose two hypotheses that could explain this, this result. The first of them, of my two hypotheses, is that the wells produce this cyclic and consistent operating noise that frankly is really quite similar to the white noise that we would produce, that sometimes we actually buy to put in our bedroom so that we sleep better. So I've just been calling this the white noise hypothesis in my head, and I wonder whether the noise from the wells is actually masking potential signals or acoustic information that might indicate that there are predators present in these landscapes. And as a result, the birds actually misinterpret their landscapes, their habitats, as being safer than they really are. So they're less stressed, and they're more relaxed, and they put more energy into growth, which is why they end up being lovely and healthy. But in fact, they also can't respond properly to predators. There's a second possible explanation for this. So we found that moms that are closer to wells actually had higher stress responses in some ways if they were near noisy sites. Although I actually have to emphasize that this was not the case near real wells. This is a case near the noise, our noise experiment. We also found that moms that have higher stress responses produce offspring that have lower stress levels and that grow faster. So basically, the moms on the noisy sites are preparing their offspring well physiologically to live in this stressful and dangerous world. So if you're in a stressful environment and you know that your offspring are going to live in a stressful environment for their whole lives, there's evidence from our research, but also from other lab research, that it's evolutionarily a good strategy to produce young with lower stress responses and lower stress hormones, because there are all sorts of negative impacts of having very high stress levels for your whole lives. As anyone who has lived through the last 8 months of the pandemic is well aware of, there's all sorts of negative impacts of stress on your body health. And so this is potentially actually an evolutionary strategy to produce young that are well suited for a stressful and dangerous world. We happen to know for some of our other research that this relationship between parental stress levels and offspring stress levels does explain some of the patterns we see in nestling stress levels, but it does not explain all the patterns that we see in nestling stress levels. So my conclusion is that probably both of these hypotheses are contribute to this pattern we see in stress hormones, both this white noise hypothesis and the female physiological mediation of her offspring. So the consequence of this is that eggs or nestlings that are near wells or near drilling noise are actually more likely to get eaten by predators. But if they make it, they're larger, healthier, and better prepared physiologically for a relatively dangerous world. So there's a trade-off there. So in terms of take-home messages from our research before we go on to mitigation strategies, oil wells and drilling noise have a range of impacts on grassland birds. Many of these impacts are due to the presence of wells and other above ground infrastructure like roads, power distribution lines, and only the reduction of the above ground infrastructure could mitigate these impacts. So there's no point in focusing all our energy on noise if that's not causing these patterns. However, it's true that some of the impacts that we see from the oil and gas industry are due to noise, particularly drilling noise. So it seems clear that we should try to limit well drilling noise. It's less important for us to limit well operating noise. And I would argue that we should regulate noise according to its quality, not just how loud the noise is. So the next question is, what can we do about this? So if we're concerned about noise, one thing we can use is sound barrier walls. And these are very effective and well engineered in order to reduce propagation of anthropogenic noise. And you may not have heard this term before, but you've probably seen them yourselves running along highways to prevent highway noise from propagating too far into the neighboring areas. And sound barrier walls are also used around drilling rigs. So in this particular picture, the sound barrier walls have been placed in such a way as to prevent too much disturbance from noise from going into this homestead. But we could use sound barrier walls around drilling rigs in order to prevent the noise from going too far and disturbing wildlife as well. I think, in my personal opinion, this research has implications not just for the oil and gas industry, but for also other kinds of anthropogenic noise. And clearly roads are an important source of noise. One easy way to reduce impacts of noise is simply to lower speed limits, as slower vehicles produce less noise. And in some specific cases, we might even consider seasonal closures of roads. It's also clear, though, that we need to mitigate the effects of the above ground infrastructure as well. So what we can do in this case is reduce above ground infrastructure. We can cluster above ground infrastructure in small areas in order to reduce the overall area that's affected by it. And today we can accomplish this using horizontal and directional drilling. So there are commercially available options that can reduce impacts of noise and how much area is affected by above ground infrastructure. But I would argue that getting buy-in from industry and getting making these suggestions acceptable to industry is going to work a lot better if we focus on using these options where we really need them, rather and not require them in areas where the noise is an annoyance but doesn't have a lot of ecological impacts. So as a result, I would suggest that we need to refine the existing noise pollution regulations and best management practices to emphasize the management and reduction of propagation of drilling noise, and that we should spend less time worrying about well operating noise. I'd also argue that we should do further research to evaluate whether it is the unpredictability of drilling noise that explains its impact, because if unpredictable noises have much greater impacts on wildlife than predictable noise, then regulations should differ for predictable and unpredictable anthropogenic noise. So this is one of the studies that I've initiated, that I'll be initiating as we move forward. And so that's it. Thank you so much to many field assistants, and graduate students, bioacoustics technicians, and postdoctoral fellows who have contributed to this work, and many landowners, leaseholders, and land managers. And in particular, I think Susan Patey Ledrew, who is formerly with Synovus Energy, was really helpful in getting this research off the ground. So I'm very appreciative to her in particular. And so that's it.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I guess you can take me off.
We'll leave it on in case you want to flip back and forth for to answer some questions here. But thank you for the fabulous presentation. It was really, really interesting. If it's okay, we do have a few questions from listeners. The first one, named Ross, is wondering if you looked at flow lines between wells and battery sites.
We did not. We had hoped to look at the potential impact of batteries as opposed to connecting using pipelines to the short answer is we just weren't able to design our study in a way that allowed us to look at that, unfortunately. We have done some research we've done, though, that's related to that, is to do with the roads that are associated with the wells. And we do see significant declines in parental care of offspring that are closer to roads. So wells have a greater impact on parental care, but roads clearly have an additional impact on parental care. And in fact, roads have a major have lots of edge effects associated with other habitat suitability and habitat condition for birds. And so once we start talking about whether there are roads present and how extensive they are, then we start getting into this other area where we're talking about all sorts of impacts of roads per se. I should note that I think the oil and gas industry has been good about minimizing, like not putting in more roads than it really needs to, especially in more recent years. That's designed to try and minimize that. But clearly, the roads can have impacts. Sorry, that only tiny bit addresses what your question was about.
That's okay. It's a good answer. A listener named Susan is wondering if you know the costs related to a sound barrier for a drill site.
So I'm not sure what the cost is for the sound barrier walls. You can put mufflers on oil wells, and I don't know, maybe I probably shouldn't even say it. It's in the order of a few $1,000s. Someone, probably better people on this call, can actually give an answer to that. So for the mufflers can make the wells more quiet, but I think as we've talked about already, the mufflers probably aren't really very necessary for oil wells. So then we go to the sound barrier wall. I mean, the sound barrier walls, like, they're obviously movable. You would invest in the sound barrier walls that can then be used in association with the drilling rigs as the drilling rigs move around the landscape. So sorry, again, that's only a moderate answer to your question.
That's okay. It gives a ballpark idea, so thank you.
If anyone knows the answer to that question about the cost of sound barrier walls, it strikes me as probably realistic to request them. Anyway, if anyone knows the answer, please go ahead and text in the chat to Caitlin so that she can share that knowledge with everybody.
Perfect. I'll keep an eye out for that one. A listener named Erica was wondering if the research took weather patterns into consideration for the results.
Yeah, so it's actually tough to, there's all sorts of weather issues that we can take into consideration. We often do include weather variables in our models just to control for them. I'm not quite sure which weather pattern she's talking about. What I had hoped to do, and we were never very successful at, is measure the prevailing wind, and that's important because wind moves how affects how noise is heard across the landscape. And ultimately, we just decided, well, we have to assume that even though the effects of noise on any one day might be different because of the wind, it's cumulatively over the course of the whole season that we really need to worry about it. We've done other work on weather patterns. So weather is very important for grassland bird populations. And in fact, there's a lot of reasons to believe that unusual extreme weather events suppress grassland bird populations quite significantly. And in fact, that regulates grassland bird populations more than any one sort of factor on the landscape. So I think I would think of the work we've done so far as giving us information about the additive effect that humans have on the landscape, in addition to things that we can't really manage, like weather. It's not to say that the weather doesn't also have a really important effect. So far, there is not much evidence that climate change up until this point explains very much at all about changes in grassland bird populations. That's obviously not to say that in the future climate changes that will be occurring, those could be important. But I've just finished doing a worldwide review of over 2,000 papers on grassland bird conservation. And in fact, there's very, very little evidence that climate change, maybe even no evidence that climate change actually explains any of the patterns that we see with grassland birds at this point. But I would just want to clarify that that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. That's another rambling answer for you. Anyone is welcome to email me after this presentation. You can just find my email address on the University of Manitoba website, and we can chat more specifically about your questions if that's helpful at all.
Perfect, thanks. There's a couple listeners wondering about vibration, in particular, how much noise is related to vibration? Do you have any plans to look into or separate out the effects of vibration?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really interesting question that we initially wanted to assess using vibration blankets and stuff like that. It ended up not being practical to do that, but sound travels much farther away from we're talking about waves, of course, and when waves, i.e. sound, travel through the air, they travel much, much farther than do vibrations, also again waves, as far as vibrations travel through the soil. And so it does seem pretty likely that the effects we see are caused by the noise rather than the vibrations. And I've looked into the literature and I found no information at all that actually where someone else has studied those vibrations. So I think the short answer is I haven't looked at it. The long answer is that I think our understanding of how energy travels through different mediums suggests that probably it's not the vibration that's the problem. But we don't know for sure. And if we looked at something like snakes, it would be interesting to see if there were patterns, effects on snakes.
Yeah, that would be interesting. A listener named Sheila would like to know if there's been any studies done to determine the effectiveness of drilling rig barrier walls in increasing nesting success.
So no, I've only seen predictive models which have shown that if you use the sound barrier walls, they do have quite a big impact in terms of reducing the area that's affected by noise. So it can reduce the area affected by noise by about 70%. But I don't know of studies that have actually looked at sound barrier walls. And actually, I'd love to look at that question if any of the industries out there wanted to do a joint project with me where we could actually test that.
Yeah, that would be really neat.
Yeah.
A listener named May is wondering if or how much predation is due to accessing the nest and handling the birds in research. Do you think there's an impact there?
That is, so I think that's a really great point. We always need to be really concerned and worried about that. One
Mhm.
way we can sort of answer that question, at least within the context of this study, is that we handle the birds the same amount in all of the treatments. So if we see an increase in um, nest predation in one treatment compared with another, we know that it's because of the treatments. It's not because of the way that the humans have handled the birds. Research that was done a few decades ago showed that if you visited the nests every day, then you could have an impact on nest predation. But if you visit them no less often than that, then there was no evidence that the nest visits increased predation rates. And so we try not to go to the nests more than every 2 to 3. We try to use a 2 to 3 day period, if not long, 2 to 4 day period if possible, when we don't actually visit the nests themselves. And we use all sorts of protocols to try and minimize our impacts.
Yeah,
So yeah, so we put the cameras not too close to the birds, and we minimize how much time we're handling them and all that kind of thing. But I think
perfect. Yeah.
ethics in research is very important.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, thank you for that answer. A listener named John is wondering if parents are better able to forage and find bugs near oil and gas infrastructure.
So I think that's a really interesting question. I've been hoping to address that, and I just haven't had the resources to do it so far. I think the one thing that makes me hesitate, though, is that there's quite a lot of research out there that shows that there's kind of a superabundance of insects in grassland landscapes in North America compared to how many insects need to be there um, to feed the birds that are there. So for example, there's been research done in Alberta actually on chestnut-collared longspurs where where some of the birds were exposed to an insecticide. Well, sorry, not the birds, but the landscape were insecticided such that they reduced the abundance of insects in those areas by 90%. And there was zero change in how many babies they could raise and how healthy and heavy the babies were and how well the parents were able to feed. And so I think this, on top of a bunch of other studies that have had fairly similar conclusions, suggests that in this particular ecosystem, i.e. specifically when we're talking about grasslands of North America, these patterns probably are not driven by how many insects are there or how available they are. And in fact, we would think there are some reasons to think there might be more insects, as I think perhaps
Mhm.
the audience member is suggesting that there might be more availability of insects where the vegetation is lower around the wells. Um, so I've emphasized how important insects are in this grassland ecosystem, which is actually probably not very important based on all of the literature that is available. That's not to say that in other ecosystems like forested habitats of North America or some of the much more heavily intensively agricultural parts of the UK and other parts of Europe, where actually insect abundance could affect those population trends. And this is relevant because, of course, we have to worry about the potential role of pesticides on birds. So there's a very long answer to an interesting and insightful question.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. A listener named Dina is wondering if there's been any research into the shape, height, or color of infrastructure.
Um, so I was so there isn't very much that's looked at that well. One of the reasons we were interested in the potential differences between pump jacks and screw pumps is because the pump jacks are taller, they move in a cyclic manner, they sort of have more of a visual
Mhm.
difference on the landscape in comparison with the screw pumps, which is a newer technology. It has different acoustic profile and it's much lower to the ground and it doesn't move up and down and stuff like that. And so we didn't find very many differences between those two types of infrastructure. And in fact, the screw pumps had a little bit of a larger impact on the nesting success, which I don't know for sure why that is, but I actually suspect it's because screw pumps tend to have a larger area that's gravel. So I think how much vegetation has actually been removed from each of the well pads is probably somewhat important. This doesn't exactly address what she's asked about, but it's still about the appearance. I do think that if a bigger area is disturbed, it's going to have it does seem to have a larger impact. And there's a few other systems where I've seen, like, for example, wells that are buried underground. Those tend to have a really tremendously large area that's impacted in terms of habitat loss. And so I think that's actually something to keep in mind, is trying to make these well pads as small as possible. In terms of height, I actually would say, coming back to another question earlier about the sound barrier walls, one thing that does worry me about sound barrier walls is simply how high they are. Although there's so much disturbance associated with drilling rigs anyway, that I don't think that they would have much of an additional impact. I think they probably, weight of evidence is that the drilling rig would probably have less of an impact if we had sound barrier walls. And so I could actually go on with some of my ideas, but in terms of answering that question, but no real data, so I might as well stop talking now.
A listener named Michael is wondering if you know if Alberta's 90% fossil-fueled grid has something to do with the declines in productivity around grid-powered sites.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious if that's true. Essentially, what I wonder is whether the reason we found lower nesting success in sites that were grid powered was simply because those sites also at a much greater scale happened to be in areas where there was a power grid, and therefore there was a little bit more development. And so maybe what's happening is that there's these landscape scale changes that are happening as a result of the power grid itself. Well, sorry, not really the power grid, it's the development in general, the cumulative impacts of development. Some of our other research has found that when we take together the impacts of natural gas and shallow gas and oil wells and roads, that we have a tremendous impact, such that for some species there's actually no habitat left on the landscape that's not in some way negatively impacted by that development. Essentially, so I think we really should be looking at landscape level planning to try and have some parts of the landscape across Alberta, which has incredibly important grasslands left, that are relatively unimpacted by above ground infrastructure at these landscape scales. But I'd be happy to chat. Again, anybody who would like to email me, I'd be happy to chat about your ideas in a bit more personally. Yeah.
Somebody was wondering if you could repost your contact information again in case people do want to touch base and with more questions.
Yes. I think I can simply put in, I probably haven't done that, but it's, you can see the screen now, right?
Yes, yeah.
Manitoba.ca.
Perfect.
So honestly, email is the best way to get a hold of me, especially these days, because I'm working from home 100% of the time now.
Yes, like many of us.
Like many of us.
A listener named Heather has a comment. She says, on native prairie, it seems that winter drilling should be the only drilling permitted. This would bypass the need for sound barriers. Do you have any thoughts or comments about that?
I think that's a solution. So I think it's one of the solutions. You have basically two solutions. One is to use sound barrier walls. The other one is to drill outside of the breeding season of species that are at risk. And I think if we pose both of those as options to the oil industry, then the oil industry can make, at least it has choices about how it's going to deal with this problem. I'm not an engineer and I'm not a geologist, so I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question about the other potential problems you run into when you're doing this work out of those seasons. But I think one of the benefits of trying to really understand what is causing any negative impacts of energy development we see on the landscape is that if we understand the cause, it gives us much more specific management recommendations that we can then work with in collaboration with industry as opposed to sort of against industry. Like, let's try and work together so that we have economic, environmental, and social sustainability on these working landscapes.
That's a great answer. I think that's all the time that we have for today. I've had a number of different listeners write in that says, thanks for the presentation. It was very informative and very useful. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Koper. To all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in, for catching our broadcast. And if you missed something, you want to go back, it will be recorded and uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel in the near future, probably later today or tomorrow.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
That's great. I'm glad it finally worked out. I know we talked about it in the past, and this was a perfect time. So thank you again. Well, with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.